we've normalized the wrong way, and this is a little closer to the right way.
It's what HTML would have been if they would have kept developing it, right?
So whatever you're using on the back end, this makes your front end life a lot easier. It makes a big difference in things like testing. I don't need Selenium to do half these tests anymore. It does change the balance of things. Being able to get rid of React or Angular or those kinds of things have meant that they've actually allowed their customers to do larger, more complex things.
HTMX has a lot to offer Django developers. It's the developer experience going further with the skills you already know, which is ding in my book.
I first sort of stumbled across it. I was just like, oh, why couldn't it always be this easy?
Hi, everybody. I'm Paul Everett, developer advocate at JetBrains. We have a very special guest who's been with us before. Christopher Trudeau was with us to do Django Ninja. Is that right, Christopher?
Yeah, I believe that's what we did. Yeah.
Real quick for everybody, this is a little bit of a different flavor. It's not a live stream. Christopher has pre-recorded the material. We'll jump into it in just a second. And then we'll do little conversations in between each section in there where we talk about this. We're talking about Django and htmx today. And let's jump right into the segment where Christopher gives us a little bit of an introduction.
So nothing's ever free, right? Here's an embedded ad thinly veiled as me telling you who I am. My day job is a fractional CTO, which means I help organizations with both architectural stuff and technical process stuff. Generally, I try to use fancier words than stuff when I'm in front of a client, but that's the way it goes. In the middle there is where you might recognize my voice from. I'm the co-host of the Real Python podcast. Christopher Bailey tolerates me every couple of weeks, and we talk about the latest stuff going on in the Python world. There's that stuff again. And of course, if you've been listening to the podcast, you'll know I've written a book. It's called Django in Action. And in fact, the htmx stuff that you've come here for has an entire chapter on it. I'll start with a quick overview and then dive into some code so you can see how htmx works. If you've happened along this talk accidentally and don't know what htmx is, it's a JavaScript library that helps you create dynamic web pages. Before I discovered htmx, I did a lot of my dynamic web coding in Vue.js. You can't do everything in htmx that you can do in Vue or React or the others, but you can get a fair way along without writing any JavaScript at all, which as a Python programmer, I like. It does this by taking the ideas that are at the base of HTML and expanding them. In HTML, when you click on a link on your page, the browser goes and fetches a new page and replaces the one that you're on. With htmx, you can apply this same kind of logic to parts of a page using pretty much any HTML tag, although 9 times out of 10 it's going to be a div. The browser is still fetching new content, but now it's fetching snippets of pages and replacing just parts of the page with the fetched snippet. Typically with other dynamic libraries, you've got all the HTML parts downloaded already, and then when you click, the event causes some data to be fetched from the server, then pops up a dialog box or makes the change or whatever you want. Here, instead, those new parts are dynamically fetched. This means a couple things. One, your page is less complex, and two, you can use the mechanisms built into tools like Django to manage the snippets. Django's been around for a while, over 20 years in fact, and although it's been growing and changing, it's still structured in a very Web 1.0 kind of fashion. Its core concept is a URL maps to a view, which then outputs a rendered template. The htmx approach allows you to use this core concept to replace parts of the page instead. This gives you pretty dynamic pages without having to do very much lifting. htmx isn't the right tool if you're building a web-based, say, spreadsheet, but the vast majority of dynamic interactions in a business application can be done with a lot less code. In fact, the htmx website even has some case studies where React-based sites converted to htmx. One case saw a 2/3 drop in the amount of code. It removed 95% of their JavaScript dependencies and reduced page load times by 50%. An interesting side effect of all this was that their site could then handle larger data sets because the page was now lighter weight. So this is all goodness and gravy. On the Django side, you pretty much treat snippets for htmx like any other page, which means you're using the same tech for full page rendering as you are for the parts. The htmx library is also careful about informing you when an htmx event is what triggered your view. This means you can have a single view for a page that outputs either the full thing or just the snippet. This is kind of similar to how you would write a view for a form that has both get and post activities inside of it. Okay, that's enough background. You came here to see some code. I've got a basic Django project that I'm going to adapt and add some htmx features to. The features I'll be covering today are lazy loading, search as you type, and infinite scroll. I've been playing with library thing lately, so when I needed an idea for a demo, I basically just ripped it off. If you're not familiar, library thing is a site where you can catalog your book collection. My version's much simpler though. It has a book model class to store book info in the database, and then I use the Django admin so I can muck around with content if I want. To start off, the only view is a home page that lists all the books and shows their author info. And in a second, I'll open up the editor and give you a quick tour of the code so you're up to speed before I start HTMXifying it. By the way, all the code I'll be showing you here is available up on GitHub. In fact, I've split it off into steps so you can see each of the stages as I go along before the next feature is added. All right, I've got my project on the left side here. Nothing unusual in the structure, just your typical Django project. This code is from the file called step1 in the folder on GitHub. The project has one Django app, which I've called books, and inside it, you get the typical model, admin, and view files. Let me start by opening the model file. I'm keeping it simple. There's only one model in this project. For a real project, you'd want to have foreign keys to an author, etc. But the purpose here is to just show off HTMX. My model has 4 fields: a title, the author's first and last name, and then tracking the library thing ID. I've grabbed images of the book covers and I'm storing those locally using the library thing ID as the file name. Again, not the way you do it in the real world. I'm serving them up as static content, but I didn't want to complicate the example with upload handling code. Down here, I've got a couple helper methods, the typical dunder string piece, as well as a short version of the title. I have this so that inside of the Django admin, the column stays short. By the way, if you haven't seen the truncator class here, it's a hidden gem in Django. This is the class that the various truncate filters use. The class itself isn't documented, but I don't think it's going anywhere because the 4 different filters are based on top of it. And down at the bottom here, I have a property that maps to the file name for the book cover. All right, that's the model. Let's go take a look at my only view. I'm wiring this view up as the home page. It doesn't get much simpler than this. I queried all the books and then I render them as the home page. So let's go look at the home page, open up templates. I've got a base template that I'm not going to bother showing you. It contains the structures of all the pages for the site. It uses a Bootstrap 5 layout, nothing fancy, just easier to look at than the vanilla HTML. And then inside that base is a block called content, which is the placeholder for the actual content on the page, which is what I am extending here. The homepage renders all the books in the database, showing the book image in one column and the title and author information in the other. Okay, that's the key bits. I've registered the URL for the homepage in the project's URL file, and to get static library to work, I needed a bit of configuration, but for the most part, the rest is just what gets created automatically for you when you create a new project. In case you haven't coded Django in PyCharm before, there's this great feature here where you can define a environment configuration, essentially determining what gets run when you hit the play button. I've tied this to the Django development server. If you're using the community edition, you have to do this by hand, but if you've got the pros set up, there's a wizard that creates this for you. Since I've defined this environment, all I have to do is hit the play button, and it starts the Django server for me. Give me a second, and I'll switch to my browser, localhost, and there it is in all its simple glory. Lots of book images, titles, and authors.
Okay, that's a good framing of HTMX, getting us kind of oriented with the project that we're about to do in Django. Christopher, let's talk about HTMX. I like to phrase it as putting the web back in the web. What do you think?
Yeah, it's, I first sort of stumbled across it. I was just like, "Oh, why couldn't it always be this easy?" And there is actually this sort of there's this little subculture that's saying this should be part of the HTML spec. That it would it that's the future. I don't know whether it'll ever go there, but the HTMX community is, if I say rabid, I mean it in a nice way. Like there's some very very hardcore people who think this is the answer, and
Mhm.
I find particularly with business applications, I very very seldom have to switch to something heavier. It almost always solves my problem, and it just makes my life so much easier.
And one of the things that you'll show on this is you don't have to switch to something else because you already have something else called Django, which knows how to generate HTML, right?
Exactly. It fits very, very nicely with the sort of Web 1.0 architecture that Django still has underneath, although it's got other features for that. And it's also like it's not we're here to talk about it with Django, but it doesn't care. It's a JavaScript library, whatever front end you're using. It essentially just brings you new features on top of your HTML and makes it easier to call web-based view-like things and make it go. So whatever you're using on the back end, this makes your front end life a lot easier.
And you framed it correctly. That's the way Carson, the creator of HTMX, puts it. It's what HTML would have been if they would have kept developing it,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
All right, we're going to take a look at your first segment on lazy loading.
All right, so you've seen the project. It's time to start adding some HTMX features. The first one I'll show you is fairly simple, just a half dozen lines of code, and allows you to do some lazy loading. You typically lazy load if an asset is large or if you're dynamically generating it. Say you need to dynamically generate an image for a dashboard. You don't want the whole page to wait while it is getting ready, so you lazy load the image. Without HTMX, this would be a few lines of JavaScript, and then you'd have to insert a new tag in the DOM. With HTMX, you don't have to write any JavaScript at all. HTMX does its job by making new attributes available to the browser, which you apply to your HTML tags. One of the attributes I use most is hxget. This specifies a URL to get content from. All the HTMX attributes begin with the hx prefix, and not only that, but HTMX implements the whole REST interface. So there's an hxget, hxpost, hxput, etc. for all the HTTP methods. So how does the page know when to call hxget? Well, you need some sort of event. hxtrigger says when to fire, and hxget says where to get the content when the event fires. You only need 3 lines of HTML to implement lazy loading with HTMX. You create a div, which is the target for the replacement content that gets fetched from hxget. You can put something inside of the div if you like, and that will get shown until the trigger happens. Here I've used some text, but typically what you're going to do here is put in a spinner. The hx trigger specifies the event, which in this case is the page loading. You can also use other events. For example, infinite scroll uses the revealed event, which says to fire the event when the tag becomes visible. I'll talk more about that one later. What gets done when the load event fires is specified by the hxget attribute, which in this case goes and loads the URL. And that's it. Obviously, you need some code on the server for rendering this page and rendering the snippet with the content, but from an HTMX point of view, that's all you need. Lovely, n'est-ce pas? All right, let's go implement this in BookThing. I'm going to start out by creating a template. So let me just copy the home page to use that one again. Underneath the rest of this content block. And what goes here is pretty much what I showed you on the slide. Okay, now for the views. I need 2 views for this code. One to display the page, that's what I've done here, and then the other is to return the lazy loaded code. I've put a little time delay inside of this view so that you can actually see the effect of the lazy load. So it takes a little while to have it happen. This view's for the lazy loaded content. Remember, what's going to happen is the contents of the div on the HTML will get replaced. So you don't actually want the image itself, but you want HTML that shows an image. I like to keep all my HTMX snippets together, so I'm going to create a directory for them. Some people call this partials. I'm using snippets. Doesn't really matter what you use here. Must remember to import time. And now I'll go register these views. Okay, there's the views. And then the last thing I need to do is create the snippet. Again, this file is the HTML that htmx will stick inside the div. And as I want to show an image, that means an image tag. In the real world, this would likely be something in an uploads directory that you've created on the fly, but I'm just hard coding it to something I've got on hand already. And the last thing I have to do is actually install htmx. So let me open up the base file. I've got it in my clipboard here, so I'll just paste it in. And essentially what I'm doing is installing the script here. It's available on CDNs, so you don't have to download it separately and track it yourself. And that's pretty much it. Let's save this file and give it a go. Go into the URL. There's my delay. And there's the result. Speaking of lazy, I probably should have built a nav bar. Anyway, the lazily loaded dashboard-like thing is here. I love this image. I stole it from Library Thing. It shows how tall the stack of books in your collection would be if you piled them up. I'm disappointed I haven't surpassed the Statue of Liberty yet. It's nice to have goals.
All right, I like how you led with lazy loading, and the way that you introed it, you showed it as I've got something that's already working. It's already sending the HTML back, and I'm just going to take that as my starting point. Just kind of move it over there, right?
Yeah, in fact, it's sort of a theme in HTMX. Like so much of this is, oh, take something that you could do that was just a little slower or might cause a new page to refresh or something along those lines and add a few lines of code. And all of a sudden it looks a lot smoother and a lot more modern. It
Yeah.
just sort of integrates very, very nicely with those pieces that are out there. And I like starting with lazy loading from a teaching perspective because you don't have to wrap your head around too many things, right? It's just, oh, okay, I put in the URL and then there's a little delay and the browser hits it and it comes up and gets it in the background. So yeah, it's a good place to start if you're learning it.
And for the record, what you didn't say was take that thing that was already working and make it faster by installing an entirely new programming language and tool chain and framework and go learn all of that and hope 6 months from now that it still works.
Yeah, it's one of those things I've always found a little frustrating on the net. Like you'll see somebody go, "Oh, how do I do X?" And they'll be like, "Oh, well, you shouldn't. You should use that framework instead."
Right.
And it's like,
I
great.
didn't ask for that.
It's not the answer, right? And even if that framework's better, it's not that it isn't. It's just that yeah, I'm trying to solve a particular problem right now.
Yep.
And yeah, HTMX very much is sort of that drop-in replacement kind of thing. It works very, very smoothly. In fact,
The way the way
that
you
was
describe the drop-in real quick, I
no.
apologize for interrupting, but the way you describe the drop-in reminds me of something that we used to call progressive enhancement, right?
Mhm. Yeah, in fact, it's why I'm a fan of Vue. When before I was doing
Mhm.
HTMX, I tended to use Vue, and it was because I could have degrees of how much of it I was using. Whereas I find React and Angular, it's an all or nothing thing. You're there or you're not there. And so if you've already got a framework like Django happening in the back end, it's nicer to be able to put something in where you can just sort of turn the dial a little bit. And
Mhm.
HTMX is very, very much that way.
I have one little technical question. At one point, I think it's as you're showing the image in the bar chart, you have a path and you have it, I say path, URL path,
Mhm.
you have it relative to where it started from in home, and then you refactor into snippet, and then it's going to go over to HTMX, which is going to issue a request. Do the relative paths all still work?
Are you asking about the relative path of the HTML, or are you asking about the weird relative path of the image that's being lazy loaded?
The lazy loaded image.
Yeah. Okay. Let me answer both just in case anybody else has
Sure.
got
Yeah.
those questions. So for the templates, it's just because you're just running a view, you're just calling the templates the same way
Mm,
you would call any other templates. That image is a bit of a hack. So I didn't actually dynamically create anything. I'm just loading it out of static. It's acting as if that were a static file. If you were actually building a dashboard where you were using lazy loading, then the result of that would probably be you're calling a view that outputs some sort of image, usually to your uploads directory or something along those lines. You're putting a file that's dynamically generated somewhere else, and then it would get loaded. Alternatively, you could also have that snippet call a third view, and that third view could be the image itself if you wanted to go down that path, depending on what you were trying to do. But yeah, I was for simplicity's sake, I was skipping past the whole dynamic image thing and faking it out with the snippet.
and as it turned out, everything you just described in kind of the next level of Zen sounds totally normal to a Django person, right?
Yeah, it's except for the fact that HTMX is going off and doing this on an event. Everything else would just be however you were building a dashboard. So if you were doing this, if you were doing something like Django channels and doing this asynchronously, then you'd use the same mechanisms. If you were
Mhm.
just going to let the page load slowly and go to sort of stutter as each image gets filled in, it would be the exact same mechanism. So the only thing that's different
Sure.
here is that the event is causing that load instead of the initial page.
Yeah, you didn't say go read the React router documentation.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay, let's take a look at the next segment where you're gonna cover something that's a really common pattern in Django sites and all websites, which is search.
The rest of this session incrementally builds a search as you type interface with infinite scroll on the results. But to do that, first you've got to have a backend that can do a search query. Once you've got a Django view that can do search, wiring in the search as you type isn't too bad. In fact, this is kind of a thing with HTMX. You can take your Web 1.0 code, tweak it a little bit, and you get Web 2.0. But first, I need the 1.0 code. My search view is going to use a query parameter for the search text. It'll take one or more words and then do a combined query for the first name, last name, and title of the book to be the beginning of any of the words in the query. To top it all off, the results will be paginated. One, because it's good practice, and two, because I'll need that for infinite scroll when I get there eventually. All right, let's head back to the editor and get this going. All right, I'll open views.py and I need to add a new view. This one's going to be a little longer than our almost one-liners before. I'm going to start out by getting the query parameter that contains the search text. Normally I'd use a parameter here that was smaller and vaguer like Q, but once you tie it into the HTMX, this value ends up in a whole bunch of places. So I'm sticking with something that's a little more understandable, even if it means I have to type some more stuff. Because I'm using a query parameter, the browser is going to encode it, which means I need to decode it. And in order for that, I have to have the URL lib imported. So I'll go up to the top and back down at the bottom. And my squiggly red line went away because I've imported it now. In case there are no search terms, start out with an empty result. And now I want to actually process the terms. I'm splitting the search string up into parts based on spaces, and I'm going to match each part against a starts with clause in the database. Normally, a Django filter call ands its query terms together. In this case, I want or, and if you want that, you have to do something a little different. The Django Q object allows you to dynamically build queries, and each Q object works like the parameters to the filter call in the more typical way of doing stuff. So here I'm starting with a query with the first word in parts against the first name, or against the last name, or against the title. Let me just pop up to the top and create the import. Then back down to the bottom. One of the advantages of a queue object is that you can use operators to chain them together, giving me the OR condition. If I just used filter on its own, I would have ANDed these conditions together, which isn't what I want. Now my query at this point matches the part against either the first name or the last name, but it's only the first word. So now I need to loop to get the remaining parts in the query if there are some. Same kind of clause, but I want to OR equal it so it gets chained onto anything that was built already. Now that I've built the actual query, it's time to call it. And you just pass in the queue instead. And now the filter happens on the ORed clauses. Now that I've got my books, I want to paginate the results. Thankfully, Django has a class that does that for you. It's called Paginator. Let me go up to the top and import it. I'm sure my lack of alphabetizing here is driving some of you crazy. Black would fix it for me. Okay, let's paginate this. To use the paginator, you instantiate it with two arguments. The first is the query set you want to have paginated, and the second is the number of items on a page. You probably want something bigger than 2, but this helps me show it off. A good site would also have query parameters so users can override the number. Do you remember when I earlier mentioned that I was lazy? Yeah, don't expect that to change in this demo. Once you've got the paginator object, you call its page method to get a page from the paginated values. So I grab a query parameter called page, defaulting to 1 if it isn't given, and then I pass that into the paginator to get the current page. All that's left is to stick this in a context so I can render it. The object list is the paginated values. So if we had 10 books in our query, the paginator would grab the first 2 or the second 2 or the third 2, depending on what the page number is, and object list would contain just those values. As next returns a boolean if there are more pages. For a real site, you should probably wrap some of this code a little more with some error checking. You want to make sure that the user doesn't do something stupid like page -5, but yeah, remember, lazy. All right, with that in place, let's build search.html. The search page should have an input box where users can type in their query. For right now, I'm not going to wire it up to the view. I just need to put it in the page so you can see it, and then I'll add HTMX stuff to it later. Okay, now I need a results section, which isn't that dissimilar from the homepage. Just loop through the books and print the results. Handily, I've got a copy of that off screen, so let me just paste it in here. And last, seeing as this is paginated, I want to check if there's another page, and if so, give a link to it. All right, that's the HTML. Now let me wire the view up. And let's try this out. There's the page. Now remember, I didn't wire the input box to the view, so I have to type the query in by hand. All right, there's with one. Oh, something's not quite right there, is it? Let me double check the code. And I kind of mucked that up. This is what happens when you copy and paste code. I don't actually want the first word over and over again. I want the remaining parts. Let's try that. Let me reload that. And now go on to the second page. And there's some B books to go with it. There we go. Fixed and working.
Okay, that search in Django again from a basis of what you already know, right? Christopher, Django, and search and HTML and templates and Django templating and stuff. What was interesting to me in looking at this is as you're implementing this stuff, you're using all of the server side machinery you already know about picking apart URLs. And that's not a fun place to be on the JavaScript side. And when you're constructing all of that stuff, you have access to the state that's already there on the server.
Yeah. And this keeps coming back to that theme of getting to 2.0 without really having to rethink your 1.0, right? So the mechanisms that a Django programmer would use in a standard sort of website where you've got, paginated results coming back, we're just going to use those same mechanisms and take advantage of the event system out of HTMX to make it happen a little more smoothly. So, uh, yeah, when I put this together, I was always like, this is a little chunky. But the reason it's a little chunky is because of what's coming. Uh,
Mm,
I could have done this in like a few steps and added pagination afterwards, or a couple of, or done something slightly less complicated with the Q query. But uh, this is a little bit of the vegetables, right? So now
yeah.
you've consumed your broccoli. The HTMX on top of it really is just okay. Now we can wire all these things, and there's almost no HTML code left. I think I write like 4 more lines the rest of the rest of the segment.
Yeah.
Everything else becomes HTMX.
Another thing that jumped out to me because I do a lot of I'm Python developer advocate and web developer advocate, so I do a lot of JavaScript frameworks and stuff like that. And over there, you get a lot of coding assistance if you're in React or Vue or whatever, and TypeScript and TSX and JSX. But all of that stuff started on the server. You'd have to mirror all of that over into the client side and have a JSON schema, or tons of machinery would start to appear to try and have all that structure that was already there on the server.
Yeah, a big part of this, because we're sort of trying to do a lightweight event mechanism on the front end, you're pushing a lot of the code into the back end. And I think I mentioned one of those essays that's on htmx.org. They had massive drops in the amount of JavaScript that they had to write.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm seeing this over and over and over again. That the essay I was talking about, I think it's 4 or 5 years old now. I just saw posting a few days ago. It was basically someone had written the exact same essay, but at their place, right? It was like, oh, we got rid of this and we got rid of that, and all this cleaned up. And like if you're already doing the dual environment of Python and Django on the back end and JavaScript on the front end, you've probably mostly hired Python people, and they all kind of hold their nose and do a little bit of JavaScript. That's my bias showing. But you sort of do what you have to on the front end. But because this sort of moves a bunch of things into the back end, it makes a big difference in things like testing. It makes a difference in how you think about these pieces, because now I no longer have to, I don't need Selenium to do half these tests anymore, because I'm pushing more of the code into the back end, right? So it does change the balance of things. It also tends to be a lot easier to check on things like performance as well, because you can beat the heck out of your code on the server side, fine tune it, and now you don't have to worry about what's going on in a person's browser or on their phone or all the rest of those things. It essentially moves the front end back to being what it is, which is a display mechanism.
You, for the record, you said testing before I did, which might be a first time ever in a recording
It-
that I've been a part of.
it- it-
And it's an important point. Both testing and performance and the other things you mentioned, it's what you already know. So you move this stuff into a partial. So then it's a different implementation. So you got to go test it. But it's the same testing stuff you already have in Django, right?
Yeah. Yes, very much so. And because Django, it fakes out the views when it tests. Like, it's not actually, you can write tests for Selenium and things like that,
Mhm.
but it's actually calling the view functions directly, pretending it's a browser. So the more you can move into those views, the more you can use Django's specific test framework without other pieces to get it all to work together.
Yeah. Okay, let's go on to the next segment. It's a step a little bit beyond this. It's still search, but it's search as you type.
Now that the longer codey part is out of the way, it's time to wire it up with HTMX. For search as you type, you're still going to use the hxget attribute, but this time you're going to use it on an input field. What changes is what causes the hxget to be invoked. Now, instead of it being based on the page loading, you want it based on key presses. Once the new content is fetched, you have HTMX replace the results of a placeholder div using a CSS query selector to specify where. And so that you're not pounding the heck out of your server, you don't want every key press to invoke a brand new search. Instead, you want to debounce. This means inserting a bit of a delay so that if the user is typing quickly, you don't search while they're typing. HTMX provides this capability by allowing you to say how long after a key press to wait before invoking. And if that's not sexy enough, HTMX also offers the ability to dynamically update a query parameter based on the contents of the input tag. This gives your users the ability to bookmark or deep link their search results. I love this feature. It's the simplest thing, and without HTMX, it would have been a pain in JavaScript to write, but here it is. Just add an attribute and it works. Putting all that together, and you get something like this. Note that the name of the input must match the name of the query parameter. That's how HTMX knows what's to populate. So the event is a key up, which gets called when the user hits a key, or technically when they let go of it. By augmenting that with changed, that modifies the event so that it only triggers if the contents of the input change. This way, pressing an arrow key doesn't trigger the search. The other part here is the delay. This is the debouncing. So the full event is a key up that changes the input and then is followed by 500 milliseconds of no other events. You set the target to tell the input where to stick the results, and this little attribute is all you need for the deep linking feature. Add hx push URL true, and the contents of the input tag get expressed as a query parameter with the same name as the tag. Deep linking out of the box. All right, that's the idea. Let's use this to update book thing. All right, let me open up the search. Scrolling up to the input here. And now I'm going to add the HTMX attributes. The hxget points to our search view. This is the trigger with the debouncing feature. I want the results to go into a div that I'm going to name results. And here's the deep linking thing. That's the HTMX. Now let's deal with the results on the page. The next thing I want to do is move all of this result output so that it becomes part of the dynamic content. That means I want to put it in a snippets file. When the dynamic part gets loaded, this snippet will display the actual results. I'm using static in here, so I've got to add up a import. Oh, and I missed the more part. So let me go back. And this will now be inside the snippet. Now, if I'm deep linking the page, I don't want a dynamic call in order to populate the page. I want to show the results directly. Luckily, I can take advantage of Django to do that. This is where my results are going to go. And by including the snippet directly, I can create a page without doing the dynamic piece, populating the first set of results, enabling us to do deep linking easily. The last thing I need to do is update the view so that the hx get fires properly. Remember back here with lazy loading, I used two different views, one for the page and one for the actual snippet. You don't have to do that though. HTMX turns on a header for any calls it invokes. So like with a form where you check the request method, you can also check for the HTMX header and render a snippet instead of the full page. You could write the code that checks that header by hand, but there's an easier way. There's a third-party library called Django htmx, which provides a bunch of tools to make your Django htmx experience simpler. One of which is to put a boolean on the request object. I'll show you what that code looks like, and then I'll show you how to set the library up. So here's that boolean that I was talking about. If HTMX calls this view, this will be true, and this chunk will render instead of this chunk. This means that when HTMX is calling, the snippet gets returned, and when the browser's calling on its own, then the full page gets returned. I've stuck in a little delay here as well to mimic a query that's more expensive, and makes it a little easier to demo this stuff happening dynamically. It'll be even more important when I start doing infinite scroll later. All right, I mentioned Django htmx. You pip install that puppy, but you do have to make a couple configuration changes. So let me just show you how to do that. I need the app. And because it mucks with request, it uses middleware to do that. And instead of typing it out and getting it wrong, I've got it in my clipboard. Okay. That's pretty much everything it goes. Let's fire this puppy up and try it out. Well, that was fun. This is what happens when you do things live. Static's a library, not a string. Let me go back to the editor. Trying again. And there we go. I got a page. Let me search. And as I start typing things, it updates and goes along. Getting more. And of course, we can deep bookmark now. And there are the results.
Okay, Christopher, this one was really interesting to me because of key press.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because it starts to show HTMX, it's like Carson has thought about these things a little bit, and he's thought about the event system in the browser. He had a background in something called intercooler before this, and then how it all fits together. Key press is a pattern on the browser side with a lot of sharp edges. And so you got to do extra things like debouncing. But you wound up covering it in this segment because HTMX actually solves that, but solves it declaratively, right?
Yeah, it's the Carson's experience at doing this before and actually using this means this isn't somebody just sort of dreaming up what if it could, right? Like that there's a lot of practicality behind this, and you can see it all through the library. The you know the string that they use for the event I find a little weird. Like you sort of we're parameterizing it sort of, but once you kind of get over the ugliness of it, there's a lot of power there, right? So the fact that they've thought about the fact that there are different kinds of key presses, right? I don't want
Mm.
moving the cursor to invoke the search. I don't want to be going back to the server because somebody's hit a key that doesn't actually change anything. I don't want to be going to the server if somebody's typing particularly quickly. I don't want to be going to the server 15 times so that they can type their their 15 letters. Let them type it and then figure it out afterwards, right? So uh, the my hesitation about how the syntax of event and then random attribute and random attribute, as long as you're kind of comfortable with that sort of magic wand that goes inside of that quote mechanism, it solves the problem and it works quite effectively.
And similarly, and I think you covered this in the segment, HX push URL
Yeah, this is
is
one
an
of my
argument that's worth its weight in gold because I do not want to deal with the pile of crap that is the JavaScript API for dealing with
yeah.
history.
Yeah, it's a thing of beauty, and it, not only is it just hey, let's add an attribute and it's done, but it's the kind of thing that I have frequently intentionally not done because of exactly what you're talking about, right? Like it's a nice to have feature. No one's ever going to scream and yell if it's not there. It doesn't stop you from making money. You can just keep doing your process, right? Like it just
Yeah.
isn't a necessary thing. But the by adding an attribute equals true, and all of a sudden you've got deep linking, you've got bookmarking, and it's like, yeah, this is a it comes back to our theme. This is the way HTML should have been in the first place. Can we get this added to the standard?
And it's also your theme about the development process. You started with something that was already there, cut and pasted it into another template, kind of like progressive enhancement again.
Yes, yeah.
Um, you also, I think, gave a mention to the Django htmx package by Adam Johnson, right?
Yes, it's for the example that I'm using in the slides here. It's not absolutely necessary. You can essentially, it allows you to sort of check the header. So HTMX sets a header every time an event calls the view, and this allows you to differentiate between the HTMX call versus a standard browser call. And as I mentioned, this allows you to do things kind of like the get and post model that we're used to inside of Django
Mhm.
when dealing with forms. So you could write it's about the same amount of code to actually check the header, but it's just cleaner to have it in the requests. There are deeper things in that library that are worthwhile, though. There's things that you can do inside of the middleware that make exception handling on the request different. So you can you can flip basically like a debugging bit and get them to 404 properly so that if the HTMX call is causing problems, it's easier to debug that. So there's some
Ah.
deeper stuff in this library that's definitely worth looking into. But yeah, there's beauty in just being able to say request.htmx and have your code rather than the it saves whatever it is 7 or 8 key presses. So
I think Carson has seen this movie before. You get the feeling that
very much so, yeah, yeah.
okay, let's get on to our next segment, a foot gun of epic proportions if you've ever tried to use it, how to bring your site down without even trying, infinite scroll.
Having a more button is so yesterday. Let's add infinite scroll. So if you haven't come across the term before, I know you've come across the experience. Infinite scroll is when contents get added on the fly when you get to the bottom of a page. Pretty much all the social media feeds use this pattern. I'm not sure that's an argument for doing it. Nevertheless, you pretty much already got all the tools for this already. It's similar to lazy loading. The only difference is the event that triggers it. The revealed event gets fired when the tag it is in gets rendered on the page. To modify search as you type so that it uses infinite scroll, all you have to do is replace the more button with a div triggered by the revealed event, and you're good to go. Recall, the more button got moved into the results snippet. So let me open that up. And I want a div. Copy and paste the URL from my button there. The event triggering this is this tag being revealed on the page. And here's something a little new. By default, if you don't specify otherwise, the content of the tag being triggered gets replaced, the insides. In this, I don't want the insides replaced because then the revealed tag would still be there and you'd get another revealed event. I've done that. It's ugly. It spirals infinitely. What I want to do is wipe out the holding div. The hx swap attribute specifies the behavior of replacement. Using outer HTML, like I have here, says to replace the whole div rather than only its children. Don't need the button anymore. Put a little message. And then close the div. That's it. No Python changes. Everything's already there. Just add the dynamic stuff to the HTML and you're ready to go. Let me try this out. Go back to my search page. Fetch in a couple things. There's only 2 items per page, so it's loading 2 at a time. As I scroll down, I'm done. So I'll go back up, add another search term. There's the new results. Loading, pause, scroll down, loading, pause, and it's done. Well, that's a quick intro to htmx, but I've barely scratched the surface here. There are lots of other parts to the library. I mentioned at the top that hxget has siblings, pretty much all the HTTP methods. There are other events as well. You can detect mouse movements, like on enter or exit. You can check clicks. You can do periodic polling and other stuff. You can use CSS style transitions when a swap happens, making things look a little slicker. And there's a built-in confirmation mechanism. So if you want to do an "Are you sure" dialog when somebody clicks something, the event firing can be contingent on them pressing yes. The docs are pretty good, so htmx.org is a decent place to start if you want to dig deeper. And they have loads of examples there, including everything I covered, as well as click to edit. So you have a text widget become an input and back again, multi-selecting rows, doing bulk edits, progress bars, uploads. It integrates with Bootstrap and other tools if you're using their dialog boxes, animation, drag and drop, keyboard shortcuts, other stuff. See, I brought back the stuff from the beginning there. Lots of stuff. Okay, I can't let you get away with one more ad. Everything I covered today is part of Chapter 12 of Django in Action. The book is divided into 3 parts. Part 1 covers the base chunks of Django, views, templates, and the ORM. Part 2 is about the deeper components of the framework, like how to deal with multi-user sites, forms, and file uploads. And then Part 3 is a tour of different third-party Django libraries. There's a chapter on APIs with Ninja. There's the htmx one, and then there's a Power Tools chapter that covers a load of smaller libraries that are useful when building sites. The book's based on a single project, so with each chapter, you're building on the last, and there's no toy problems. At the end, you'll have the pieces that you need for a robust multi-user website. The link in the bottom left-hand corner here is to the Manning site. The book's also available on Amazon. Both digital and Dead Tree versions are there. On Manning, if you buy the paper copy, you get the digital copy for free. And if you are using Manning, the code TrudeauJet24 will get you a 45% discount.
Okay, that's infinite scroll. It feels in the segment like, this is a little step up from things like pagination or whatever, but behind the scenes, the declarative nature of HTMX is really helping you out, right?
It definitely saves you a whole bunch of code. It is still a little bit of a foot gun. It's just a smaller caliber bullet. If you don't remember the outer swap HTML, you can run into the same kind of recursive descent problems that you can with less helpful code. So yeah, there is still a little bit of danger here, but there's far less code to do it. And I in putting together this sample, I did forget that outer wrapper myself. But it becomes immediately evident because you just sort of see, oh, there's the title, and there's the title nested inside of it, and then there's the title nested inside of it. Where's Control
Yeah.
C? So and it just becomes a quickly, oh, great, okay, I got to remember what I'm swapping and what I'm not swapping. But yeah, there's it's starting to become repetitive, Paul. This saves you a whole lot of work, right? So yeah, the concept of it is very, very straightforward. It maps very nicely. There's a few spots here that you have to remember, like which div you're loading. Am I loading inside the div or am I replacing the whole thing? But once you've got the knack of those kinds of things, it smooths out the coding a lot, and you've got a lot less to write.
And one of the things that jumped out to me in this segment was Carson's got basically a book, right, on the web platform, web architecture, and hypermedia, and
Mhm.
how HTML and linking fits into all of this. And in this segment, you're showing these attributes you put in there, kind of mirroring the HTTP interface, right?
Yes, in fact, so the like the HX get can be any of the I always call them REST calls because that's where I use them, but technically they're just HTTP methods.
Yep.
So you can do the gets, the puts, get, put, post, uh,
Delete
patch. There we go.
options.
Delete all the rest of those things.
Yeah.
So there's an HX attribute for each one of those things. So this is that's a subtle thing, but that gives you an awful lot of power. So one of the examples that's on htmx.org is a click as you edit, or click to edit, excuse me. And so you've got something that looks like a form but isn't a form, like some text blob,
Mm.
like an address, like say, right? So and then there's a button that says edit, and then it replaces the HTML that's there with the form on the fly. Well, so you're in get mode, and then you want to be in post mode. Well, again, you're just taking the same div, replacing it, putting it out, and you get to post the form. You're using hx post instead of hx get. So yeah, all these things all wire together, and you're using all the same mechanisms you would normally use in more static pages, which makes it. If you're already a web developer and you understand these mechanisms on the back end, it takes very, very little to pick this library up.
Right. And what you were just describing, little bit of a change right there. That seems to be the place where people immediately just want to jump off the cliff and switch from I have a site to I have an app, and in the app has all this other little stuff. And for me, one of the big takeaways is HTMX is extending the runway for what you can do with your site. And a lot of those things, those really little things, are what people are throwing this big pile of JavaScript at.
It's not just the JavaScript; it's even the HTML itself, right? So if I were to do some of these things in Vue, um, the classic page I have, if let's say I've got 3 or 4 different dialog boxes that need to come up, well, that HTML page has to have all those dialog boxes in it, and then I've got Vue calling Bootstrap, and I've got Bootstrap modal, and I got to cross my finger that I wired that correctly for them all to pop up. And if the user doesn't do any of that on the page, they have still downloaded all that crap into the browser. Now, by moving this into snippets, you don't have that problem because now those dialog boxes become snippets. They're on the server. And so if the user interacts with it and hits it, it'll go and fetch it. So this shrinks the size of the page. Mentally, as the developer, it also it feels more module to me.
Mhm,
HTML isn't really set up for modular programming, right? So
mhm.
one of the things I do sometimes in Django is I will stick stuff in separate HTML files and then include them, knowing that that's more expensive from a compile perspective, from compiling the template perspective, just so that I can organize my code, right? Like
Yeah, sure.
I
Yeah.
don't want the 500 lines of HTML. Well, the nature of this is you're using that sort of modular thinking as you go, and there's an elegance to the architecture of it, and it feels separate. Oh, I've got the dialog box. For the most part, the dialog box is self-contained. That goes in its own file. It's got its own view. There's a cleanliness that goes with this, and all of it's just as a side effect of the way the library thinks about things.
And if I remember correctly, those patterns are the kinds of things that Adam was trying to automate a little bit out of the box for his Django HTMX package, right?
Yeah, it helps with some of these pieces. Yeah.
The composition of things like that. So we've talked a lot about developer experience and how HTMX really lets you continue being a Django developer and go further with your site without having to switch over to this other architecture. But what one of the last things people will say is, well, performance. I need a single page application to go through my site so that it feels like an app or something like that. I believe both of us have seen a counter revolution happening this year a little bit. The people in the world of Django are questioning that. People in the world of the web are questioning that. You just touched on it a little bit. Maybe the fast way is actually slower, right?
Yeah, it's I'm conscious of my bias with this, and I've got enough gray at the temples there. I'm not quite at your level, but I'm almost there. Um, I, I try my best when I'm building these things to do what is best for the customer.
Mhm.
And I think we get bogged down in is the UI slick? Is it pretty? And that can help you with things like sales, but fundamentally, a lot of the times, does it really matter whether or not the dashboard widget inside of it refreshes without the page refreshing, or whether it refreshes if the page does refresh? And as long as the page comes down quickly, I know it
Yeah.
doesn't look quite as slick, but does the user actually gain anything from that interaction, right?
Yeah.
So where some of this slickness is important is, being able to drag and drop something. That's an interface that you can use that you wouldn't be able to do in the 1.0 world. So HTMX allows you to sort of decide where your slider is with that, right?
Well
So
said.
how much of that do you want? What does it mean? And there is a quantum gap between it and libraries like React and Angular, because the entry level for those are, oh, no, we're controlling all of that on the front end. You don't have a choice. Like I mentioned before, this was why I tended to favor Vue, because I could do things like, oh, for the pages that are just going to be 1.0 load, I could do that. And then I would stick some Vue in order to, do the on the fly, add something to the schedule or whatever.
Mhm.
So that you're not having to load a new page each time that happens. Well, HTMX allows you to do a lot of those things. So, I mentioned earlier, am I going to write a spreadsheet in this? No, but 95% of business applications don't need that kind of functionality. And HTMX shrinks that gap. A lot of the things that you would want in the business style applications will get you there. And it's got things like polling in it, right? So, like
Yeah.
I've seen people build games in it. And they essentially are just using the polling mechanism in the background and a WebSocket, and all it does is my browser pulls your browser through the server, and then, okay, oh
Mhm.
yeah, Paul's done his turn, he moved his rock, it's my turn to move my rock, right? So you can get a long way towards fully dynamic applications, uh, and yet still use basic HTML and frameworks like Django on the back end, and oftentimes with a lot less code. And to come back to I'm yammering now, I can tell, but to come back to sort of your question, um, uh, the users of this, the people who've been using it in the field, have found that because it means so much less JavaScript and because it means the bundles are smaller,
Yep.
you tend to get a lot more performance. So there's several essays on the htmx.org site where the shrinking of the code by being able to get rid of React or Angular or those kinds of things have meant that they've actually allowed their customers to do larger, more complex things, because you're not eating up as much of the browser's memory. So you get this performant side effect, not because you actually optimized, but just because there's less things going on. And so,
Sure.
hey, you get a boost automatically, right? So it feels a little bit like a free lunch, but I think it's really because we've gotten so used to doing it. I'll be as bold and say the wrong way, right? We've normalized the wrong way, and
Mhm.
this is a little closer to the right way.
So, just for those 2 points for why people should care, you get to keep the developer skills you already have and know, and you probably get better performance. HMX has a lot to offer Django developers. It's the developer experience going further with the skills you already know, which is ding in my book. But also, you actually might get better performance than switching to a single page application. Christopher, you've got a book. This is just one of the chapters in the book. In the video that we are seeing today, you cover a little bit about the book, but just give us a quick blurb. What are a couple of the other things in the book?
So for folks who've come from Django before already, there are some good chapters in here. You mentioned up at the top that we've chatted before about Django Ninja. There's a chapter on that. There's a chapter on power tools, so the small things that you might want to plug in to make your development experience easier. And for that's kind of the last third of the book, and the first two thirds are for folks who are learning the framework.
Hey, last thing, what was it like writing a book, and will you ever do it again?
I get the question a lot. I really should have like a pre-canned answer at this point and not have fear in my eyes. What I've kind of been telling people is some of the stuff that I thought was going to be easier was harder than I thought it was, and some of the stuff I thought would be harder was easier than I thought it was. It's it's one of those things for some reason people hold in awe, and quite frankly it's about perseverance more than anything else. Like you just kind of have to keep going at it. I've tried to be uh, as grateful as I can be about all the folks who've helped me behind the scenes. Manning's got a great multi-part review process. They've got the early release of the books, and that made a big difference for me because it's the same with the video courses when I do them, right? It's like
Mhm.
okay, you do it and then you cross your fingers and then you stick it out into the world, and then it's like 2 months later somebody comments on it and goes, this doesn't make any sense. And you don't want that, particularly if you've just killed a whole bunch of trees. So
Sure.
this pre-release process made a big difference, and I hope it made it a better. Well, I know it made it better. I don't know if it made it great, but it definitely made it better. It could have been worse. There's the humble way of
Could have
saying
been
it. Could
worse.
have been worse.
Let that be the mantra for, the wrap up of this. Joy,
There you go.
perseverance, and HTMX could have been worse.
Worse.
Christopher Trudeau, thanks for joining us today. Thanks for educating us on the way we should do our Django.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun.